Scientists and politicians have been sounding the alarm on climate change for decades, insisting it's one of the biggest threats mankind has faced in generations.
No challenge poses a greater threat to future generations than climate change.
But even with science backing up the claims, 170 elected representatives in the current Congress deny that humans are responsible for rising global temperatures and consequences like the rapid ice melt in Antarctica. With a federal court set to rule on a key case that could limit the EPA's authority, some environmental activists are rethinking their approach to fighting climate change. To try to build public support and put pressure on the court, activists are taking their organizational cues from a very different political movement.
It's a civil right.
Last year, marriage equality advocates mobilized in a huge effort to gather support ahead of the Supreme Court ruling in Obergefell versus Hodges. In an effort to sway the court, they framed the issue as one that could affect any American community. That's an approach activists say can also resonate with climate change.
Climate change is the most significant global problem that we face. Now, it affects everyone, not just in the United States, everyone around the world. And I think there's a window of opportunity to do something significant.
We're the first generation to feel the impact of climate change, and
President Obama announced the initiative last summer, the hottest ever recorded on the planet. It aims to cut power plant carbon dioxide emissions by 32% by the year 2030.
Public reactions to the Clean Power Plan are very important because, for one thing, they could mobilize actions in Congress, they could mobilize they could play a role in the way voters evaluate different presidential candidates.
At Richard Revez's Institute for Policy Integrity, staff members have written legal briefs in support of the Clean Power Plan, but they've also made a point of engaging with the public, publishing opinion pieces on the regulation and tweeting facts about the impact of climate change. They've broken down how much pollution costs taxpayers each year and stressed the need to discuss climate change in plain English.
Every time we have a new study, we put it out there. We try to digest it in bite-sized pieces. We try to have versions that are of interest to the experts, but also versions that are of interest to the public. A lot of the effort that's going on now is not really directed at this court's proceeding that's happening and where a case will be argued on June 6th. I mean, it's really an effort to make the American people understand what's at stake.
It's impossible to say whether activism like this has any real effect in the court. But last year's effort to start a conversation among Americans about same-sex marriage helped to turn the tide of public opinion. And Revez argues that if the EPA wins its case, detractors will soon catch up with Americans who are in agreement on climate change. Courtney Keeley, Al Jazeera.
After months of debate with doctors and drug companies, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has put its foot down, announcing new guidelines to curb prescription drug abuse.
The goal of the new guideline is to help providers improve patient care and safety and prevent opioid overdose.
The drugs in question are opioid painkillers like Vicodin, Percocet, and OxyContin. The guidelines call for doctors to give patients over-the-counter drugs like ibuprofen before resorting to prescriptions, and to give most patients only enough pills for a few days. The CDC hopes the new standards will save lives. Its director, Thomas Frieden, briefed reporters on a conference call.
The guideline reflects the best available research to date and will refine the guidance as new science becomes available. But the ongoing impact of prescription overdoses and the effect on American lives, families, and communities means that we have to act now.
2014 set a record for deaths related to opioid abuse, with more than 28,000 people dying of overdoses. The medical community has also been distressed by the link between opioid painkillers and heroin. Many patients who develop addictions to pain medication later turn to the drug, which offers a similar but less expensive high. The National Institute on Drug Abuse finds that more than 75% of heroin abusers in the 2000s started out using prescription painkillers. In 2014, we spoke with Dr. Deb Richter, an addiction specialist in Vermont, where the problem is especially severe.
In the early 2000, 2001, I started seeing a bunch of 20-year-olds come in with habits of OxyContin. And to me, that was sort of the turning point of how things started. It started out with pills.
Opioids are frequently prescribed for chronic problems like back pain or arthritis. Nearly 250 million prescriptions are written every year, with annual sales of nearly $2 billion. 30 years ago, these types of drugs were generally reserved for short-term use by patients recovering from surgery or terminally ill patients. But in the 1990s, drug companies began aggressively marketing opioids for long-term pain management.
There's no need for anyone to suffer in pain anymore.
This pill, that's the time-release pill, solves all the problems.
See what it's like when you're not in pain anymore. Take these medications.
Many doctors were happy to offer their patients the ability to pop a pill to alleviate suffering. But in 2007, OxyContin's maker, Purdue Pharma, pled guilty to criminal charges of misbranding the pill and incorrectly leading doctors and patients to believe that OxyContin was not habit-forming. This week, the CDC questioned the assumption that prescription painkillers are the best solution for chronic conditions.
But we don't have evidence to show that opioids can control chronic pain effectively over the long term. And we do have evidence that other treatments, such as exercise therapy, nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, and a variety of other treatments and modalities can be effective for chronic pain with far lower risks.
The new guidelines are not legally binding, but state regulators and insurance companies may use them to develop new rules on prescription drugs. The new standards represent the biggest step the government has taken to stop the prescription drug epidemic in its tracks. Erica Pizzi, Al Jazeera.
A late-night raid of an opposition newspaper's offices last week. After a court ruling put the paper under government control, police evicted editors at Zaman, the country's largest circulation periodical, and one that had been critical of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Protests raged outside.
Nobody can impose such a cruel measure in any part of the world. Where in the world have you seen this tyranny before?
Within days, the newspaper was publishing pro-government articles. It was the latest sign of a shift away from democracy in Turkey. And a far cry from what the country looked like 13 years ago, when Erdogan's Justice and Development Party took control in 2003, the government worked to strengthen the country's faltering economy and was widely praised for breaking the power of Turkey's once all-powerful generals. In 2012, then Prime Minister Erdogan told his party that the country had a bright future to look forward to, and that Turkey would soon be one of the greatest powers of the region and the world. But as Erdogan has led the country to increased influence, he seems intent on keeping much of the power to himself. Along with the media crackdown, anti-government protests have been met with deadly police violence in recent years. Religious minorities have been subjected to mandatory religious education, and nearly 2,000 people have been prosecuted for anti-Erdogan statements, including a 13-year-old boy. The trend towards authoritarian rule is opposed by Turkey's allies, but other events have diminished their ability to do anything about it. Many of the Middle Eastern refugees making their way to Europe pass through Turkey. A recent deal with the EU seeks to stem that flow, but the need for Turkish cooperation has made it harder for European leaders to pressure Turkey over anti-democratic moves at home.
Cooperation with Turkey doesn't mean accepting everything from Turkey. We need to be extremely vigilant, which I am, regarding certain measures that have been taken, in particular those regarding the freedom of the press.
The State Department has been critical of events in Turkey.
I think we've been pretty clear in our assessment or our concern and expressing our concern about some of the steps, not necessarily by President Erdogan, but that the Turkish government, Turkish authorities have taken against, for example, the media.
But Turkey's long border with Syria and Iraq gives it a key role in the fight against ISIL. That, in turn, means the United States and other NATO countries need Erdogan and can do little more than complain as Turkey's crackdown continues. In Turkey, members of the media are hoping for the best as well.
I think this is a dark period for our country, for our democracy, but I don't think that this dark period will continue. It cannot be sustained and it cannot be continued.
But with Western leaders relying on Erdogan's collaboration, citizens who oppose the government may be left to speak out on their own. Courtney Keeley, Al Jazeera.
The chamber finds you, Radovan Karadzic, guilty of the following counts. Count 2, genocide.
The 40-year sentence for Karadzic, a Serb leader often called the Butcher of Bosnia, holds him accountable for the deaths of thousands of civilians from 1992 to 1995. The trial is widely considered one of the most important prosecutions of war crimes since the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials following World War II. But some were dissatisfied with the verdict. Sir Geoffrey Nice led the prosecution of Slobodan Milosevic, the Serbian president who worked alongside Karadzic in an effort to rid Bosnia of its Muslim population.
Although it's a very important trial and the result is itself very important for the victims and for the people of Bosnia, it's not as important a decision as it would be if it had tracked a wider responsibility, and in particular the responsibility of Serbia itself.
Hostage taking or violation of the laws.
Karadzic was prosecuted by the International Criminal Tribunal on the former Yugoslavia, set up by the United Nations in 1993. The tribunal also handled Milosevic's trial, but he died in prison in 2006 while it was still going on. The tribunal is one of two ad hoc courts established by the UN in the wake of specific conflicts. The other one focuses on the 1994 Rwandan genocide. Both tribunals are limited in who they can prosecute and for what crimes. Following the verdict, we spoke with Mohamed Shashtabay, Bosnia's former ambassador to the UN.
We, in effect, have focused on an individual, Radovan Karadzic, but he was not acting as an individual. He was acting as the head of a joint criminal enterprise. And that joint criminal enterprise still exists. And worse of all, it still continues to perpetuate the consequences of its crimes.
The desire for a permanent body with a global remit led to the formation of the International Criminal Court, or ICC, in 1998. But not every member of the UN is in favor of the court. China, Russia, Iraq, and several other Middle Eastern countries have never joined, along with the United States. President Clinton signed an international treaty to join the ICC, but Congress has never ratified it, citing concerns that U.S. soldiers could face trivial or politically motivated charges. The U.S. has also signed deals with other countries that protect U.S. service members from being handed over to the ICC and has demanded immunity for all U.S. military personnel involved in UN peacekeeping missions.
Beijing and Moscow do not particularly have a shining record. So we can understand maybe why they would want to be beyond the reach of the ICC. But the United States frequently, at least in terms of its rhetoric, speaks of the rule of law. And I think this is a significant failure, not on the international community, but in terms of Washington's own policies.
The ICC has heard 23 cases from 10 countries since it was established. Leaders from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Uganda, Georgia, and other nations have been handed prison sentences for war crimes. But whether the International Criminal Court will ever deliver international justice remains to be seen. Courtney Keeley, Al Jazeera.